The morning sun cast long shadows across my backyard as I stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the demolition crew set up their equipment around my beloved swimming pool. After 15 years of hosting countless summer barbecues, teaching my kids to swim, and creating memories that would last a lifetime, I was finally saying goodbye to the centerpiece of our backyard oasis. The decision hadn't been easy. My wife Sarah and I had spent months deliberating over it. The pool had become more of a burden than a blessing. Constant maintenance, skyrocketing utility bills, and the fact that our teenagers now preferred their phones to swimming had all contributed to our choice. But the final straw was the medical bills. Sarah's recent surgery had drained our savings, and the insurance settlement from the accident that had left her with chronic back pain meant she could no longer maintain the pool's demanding upkeep schedule. We'd gotten all the proper permits, filed the necessary paperwork with the city, and even consulted with our homeowners association, though technically, we lived just outside their jurisdiction. Everything was legal, everything was above board, and everything was our right as property owners. Or so I thought. I should have known that Karen Whitmore from next door would have something to say about it. Karen had moved in 3 years ago, a recently divorced real estate agent who seemed to have made it her personal mission to monitor every blade of grass, every fence post, and every landscaping decision in our quiet suburban neighborhood. She was the type of person who measured the height of your hedge with a ruler and kept a detailed log of when your garbage cans were placed on the curb. Her perfectly manicured lawn looked like something out of a magazine, maintained by a crew that arrived every Tuesday at exactly 8 a.m. From day one, she'd made passive-aggressive comments about our relaxed approach to yard maintenance. The way she'd purse her lips when she noticed our grass was a day overdue for cutting, or how she'd make pointed remarks about property values during chance encounters at the mailbox. But we'd always been polite, always kept our responses measured and neighborly, even when she complained about our kids' basketball hoop being an eyesore or our dog barking during what she called quiet hours, which seemed to span most of the day. The pool demolition was set to take 3 days. Day 1 would involve draining the remaining water and removing the pool equipment. Day 2 would see the actual breaking up of the concrete and tile work. Day 3 would be cleanup and the beginning of our landscaping project. Sarah and I had plans to create a beautiful garden space with raised beds for vegetables and a small greenhouse where she could pursue her passion for orchid cultivation. As I watched the crew chief Miguel direct his team in setting up their jackhammers and concrete saws, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and excitement. This wasn't just about removing a pool, it was about starting a new chapter. Sarah had been through so much with her injury and recovery, and this garden project was something that brought genuine joy to her eyes for the first time in months. The first sign of trouble came at exactly 9:47 a.m. I was outside, discussing the timeline with Miguel and ensuring that all our neighboring properties would be protected from debris, when I heard the distinctive click-clack of high heels on pavement. Karen appeared at our shared fence line, clipboard in hand, because of course she had a clipboard, wearing a powder blue blazer that screamed, "I'm about to make this your problem." "Excuse me," she called out in that artificially sweet tone that I'd learned to dread. "I don't suppose you have the proper permits for this destruction project?" Miguel glanced at me, eyebrows raised. He'd been in the demolition business for 20 years and had seen his share of difficult neighbors, but something about Karen's demeanor seemed to put him on immediate alert. "Morning, Karen," I replied, forcing a smile. "Yes, we have all the necessary permits. The city inspector actually came by yesterday to review everything. We're all set." She made a note on her clipboard, actually wrote something down, as if she were conducting an official investigation. "And I suppose you've considered the impact on surrounding property values, the noise ordinances, the potential for structural damage to adjacent foundations?" The last point made Miguel step forward. As a professional, he took any suggestion of unsafe practices seriously. "Ma'am, we've done a complete survey of the area. This is a standard pool removal, well within all safety parameters. We've actually added extra protective measures because of the proximity to neighboring structures." Karen's expression shifted slightly, the sweet facade cracking just enough to reveal the steel underneath. "I see. Well, we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Miguel watched her go, then turned to me with a concerned expression. "Boss, I've been doing this a long time. That lady's got the look of someone who's about to make phone calls. You might want to double-check that all your paperwork is in order." I assured him that everything was legitimate and legal, but something about Karen's parting words sent a chill down my spine. Over the years, I'd learned that Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was a busybody with connections. Her ex-husband had been some sort of city official, and she'd retained relationships with various municipal departments that she wielded like weapons when things didn't go her way. The crew got to work, and for several hours, everything proceeded smoothly. The pool was fully drained, the pumps and filtration systems were disconnected and removed, and Miguel's team was making excellent progress. Sarah came out during her lunch break from working at home to check on things, and I could see the excitement in her eyes as she visualized the garden space we'd planned together. Then, at 2:15 p.m., everything came to a screeching halt. A white sedan pulled up to our curb, and out stepped a man in a wrinkled suit carrying an official-looking folder. Behind him emerged a woman with a badge hanging from her neck and a distinctly bureaucratic expression. They approached our front door with the purposeful stride of people bearing bad news. "Mr. Davidson?" the man asked when I answered the door. "I'm Inspector Williams from the City Planning Department, and this is Ms. Chen from Code Enforcement. We've received a complaint about unpermitted construction activity on your property." My stomach dropped. "There must be some mistake. We have all the proper permits for our pool removal." Inspector Williams consulted his folder. "Sir, according to our records, you have permits for pool removal, but the complaint alleges that you're conducting additional construction activities that weren't included in your original application." "What additional construction activities?" I asked, genuinely confused. Ms. Chen spoke up, reading from her own documentation. "The complaint specifically mentions excavation beyond the pool area, potential installation of underground structures, and failure to comply with setback requirements for new construction." I felt my face flush with anger and confusion. "That's absolutely false. We're only removing the pool, nothing else. You can see for yourself. Miguel, could you come over here, please?" Miguel approached, wiping concrete dust from his hands. "Is there a problem?" Inspector Williams explained the complaint, and Miguel's expression grew increasingly incredulous as the accusations were laid out. "Sir, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can show you exactly what we're doing. Pool removal. Period. The excavation is limited to the existing pool structure, and we're not installing anything. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand what they're looking at, or they're deliberately misrepresenting the situation." The inspectors spent the next hour examining our permits, measuring the work area, and documenting everything with photographs. Throughout the process, I caught glimpses of Karen peering over her fence, and I realized with growing anger that she was probably the source of the complaint. Finally, Inspector Williams closed his folder. "Mr. Davidson, your permits appear to be in order, and the work being performed matches exactly what was approved. However, we're required to investigate all complaints thoroughly. We'll need to halt all work until we can complete our review and file our report." "How long will that take?" Sarah asked. She'd come outside when she heard the commotion, and I could see the stress lines forming around her eyes. "Standard review process is 5 to 7 business days," Ms. Chen replied apologetically. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but our hands are tied until the complaint is officially resolved." Miguel gathered his crew and their equipment, shaking his head in disgust. "I'll keep your job at the top of my schedule," he promised. "Soon as you get clearance, we'll be back to finish this up." As the inspectors drove away and the demolition crew packed up their tools, I felt a rage building inside me that I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about bureaucratic red tape or neighborly complaints. This was about someone deliberately sabotaging our project, our plans, our fresh start, for no reason other than spite and control. Sarah stood beside me in our backyard, looking at the half-demolished pool that now resembled a concrete crater filled with debris and stagnant water. The excitement that had been in her eyes that morning was gone, replaced by the same defeated expression she'd worn during the worst days of her recovery. "Why would..." That evening, I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at my computer screen and contemplating my next move. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted by the day's events and the disappointment of seeing her garden dreams put on hold indefinitely. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. I'd spent the better part of 3 hours researching everything I could find about Karen Whitmore. Social media profiles, public records, professional associations, anything that might give me insight into what made her tick and, more importantly, what vulnerabilities she might have. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply troubling. Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was a serial complainer with a documented history of harassment that stretched back years. Through various online forums and neighborhood social media groups, I found references to at least 6 different disputes she'd initiated with previous neighbors: property line disagreements, noise complaints, HOA violations. The pattern was unmistakable. She would identify a target, find or manufacture a grievance, then pursue it relentlessly through official channels until she either got her way or the neighbors gave up and moved. But the most interesting discovery came when I cross-referenced her name with local court records. 3 years ago, Karen had been involved in a lawsuit with her former neighbors, the family who had lived in our house before us. The Hendersons had sued her for harassment and property damage, claiming that she had deliberately damaged their sprinkler system and filed false reports with the city that had cost them thousands in legal fees and fines. The case had been settled, out of court, but the public record showed that Karen had been required to pay substantial damages and had agreed to what appeared to be a restraining order that prevented her from filing complaints about the Henderson property for a period of 2 years. The timing was perfect. The restraining order had expired just 6 months before we moved in. I leaned back in my chair, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Our house hadn't been randomly targeted by a difficult neighbor. We had unknowingly moved into a property that had been the center of a long-standing feud, and Karen had simply been waiting for new victims to continue her campaign of territorial control. The next morning, I made a decision that would prove to be the turning point in our entire conflict. Instead of waiting passively for the city's investigation to clear us, I decided to go on the offensive. I called Miguel first, explaining what I'd discovered about Karen's history and asking if he'd be willing to document everything about our project in extraordinary detail. Then I contacted our lawyer, Janet Morrison, who had handled Sarah's medical malpractice case and had proven to be both brilliant and tenacious. "This sounds like a clear case of harassment," Janet said after I'd explained the situation. "The fact that she has a documented history of this behavior actually works in our favor. But David, if we're going to pursue this, we need to be absolutely certain that your project is completely above board. Any irregularities, any shortcuts, any missing paperwork, and she could turn this around on you." I assured Janet that everything was legitimate, but her warning made me realize I needed to be even more thorough in my documentation. I spent that afternoon photographing every aspect of our property, creating a detailed timeline of events, and gathering every piece of paperwork related to our pool removal project. It was while I was organizing these documents that I made a discovery that changed everything. Buried in the stack of property surveys and permit applications was a document I'd only glanced at previously, a geological survey that had been required as part of our permit application. The city had requested it because our neighborhood sat on what used to be marshland, and there were specific regulations about excavation in areas with potentially unstable soil conditions. As I read through the technical language and diagrams, one section caught my attention. The survey noted an anomalous subsurface structure located approximately 15 feet northeast of our pool's location. The structure appeared to be man-made, roughly rectangular, and showed signs of being constructed with concrete or similar materials. My blood ran cold as I realized what this might mean. I immediately called the survey company that had prepared the report. After being transferred through 3 different departments, I finally reached Dr. Patricia Huang, the geologist who had conducted our property assessment. "Oh yes, I remember that survey," Dr. Huang said when I explained why I was calling. "That anomalous structure was quite interesting. Based on the ground-penetrating radar results, it appeared to be some sort of buried foundation, or possibly a septic system that predated current municipal services. Is it on our property? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Actually, that's where it gets complicated, Dr. Huang replied. The structure appears to span the property line between your lot and your neighbor's. Part of it is definitely on your side, but the majority of it extends into the adjacent property. We noted it in your report because any excavation on your side could potentially affect the stability of whatever's buried there. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I immediately pulled up the property survey maps and compared them with Dr. Huang's geological report. The anomalous structure wasn't just partially on Karen's property, it was almost entirely on her land, extending from just inside our property line to well into her perfectly manicured backyard. The implications were staggering. If there was an undisclosed structure buried on Karen's property, it could represent a massive code violation, potential environmental hazard, or worse. More immediately relevant to our situation, if Karen knew. About this structure, her complaint about our pool removal might not have been simple harassment. It might have been a preemptive strike to prevent us from discovering whatever she was hiding. I called Janet immediately and explained what I'd found. "David, this could be huge," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. If she filed a false complaint to cover up her own violations, that's not just harassment, that's obstruction and potentially fraud. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. We can't go digging around on her property without permission, and we can't make accusations without proof. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "First, we need to determine exactly what's buried there. I have a contact at the city planning office who might be able to help us access historical records for that property. Second, we need to document everything about her complaint and establish a timeline that shows her pattern of behavior. And third, we need to be prepared for this to get very messy very quickly." The next few days passed in a blur of research, phone calls, and growing anticipation. Janet's contact at the city, a planning officer named Robert Chen, proved invaluable in uncovering the history of Karen's property. What he found exceeded our wildest expectations. Karen's house had been built in 1987 on a lot that had previously contained a much older structure dating back to the 1940s. When the original house was demolished to make way for the current construction, city records showed that a proper demolition permit had been issued and that all debris was supposed to have been properly removed and disposed of. However, Robert discovered a series of inspection reports from 1987 that told a different story. The demolition contractor had been cited multiple times for improper disposal of construction debris, and there were notes suggesting that significant amounts of concrete and other materials had been buried on site rather than hauled away as required. More troubling still were environmental reports from the late 1980s, indicating that the original house had been heated with oil, and that there had been concerns about potential soil contamination from a leaking underground storage tank. Reports suggested that remediation had been attempted, but the documentation was incomplete and there were questions about whether the cleanup had been properly completed. "David," Janet said when she called with this information, "if Karen's property contains improperly buried construction debris and potentially contaminated soil, she could be facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cleanup costs and massive legal liability. If she's known about this and failed to disclose it, the legal ramifications could destroy her financially. And if she filed a false complaint against us to prevent the discovery of these violations," I began. "Then she's committed fraud, harassment, and potentially environmental crimes," Janet finished. "This isn't just about your pool anymore, this is about justice." But the biggest twist was yet to come. That Saturday morning, as Sarah and I were having coffee on our back deck and discussing our next steps, we noticed unusual activity in Karen's backyard. A white van with environmental consulting company logos was parked in her driveway, and we could see several people in hazmat suits taking soil samples from various locations around her property. Sarah grabbed my arm. "David, do you think she knows that we know?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Janet, and her voice was tight with excitement and concern. "David, you need to sit down. I just got a call from Robert Chen at the city. Karen Whitmore filed a complaint yesterday. Not about you, but about herself. She's voluntarily DIA. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of karma, legal maneuvering, and unexpected revelations that would forever change our quiet suburban neighborhood. Miguel and his crew returned the following Monday to complete our pool removal, this time with a small audience of city inspectors who wanted to document that our excavation didn't disturb whatever environmental nightmare was brewing next door. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's attempt to stop our project had actually resulted in more official scrutiny and documentation than we'd ever have received otherwise. As Miguel's jackhammers broke through the final sections of concrete, I stood watching from my kitchen window with a cup of coffee and a profound sense of satisfaction. But my satisfaction wasn't rooted in revenge or spite. It came from something far more meaningful that I was only beginning to understand. The environmental cleanup next door had escalated dramatically. What had started as a small team taking soil samples had grown into a full-scale remediation operation involving multiple agencies, dozens of workers, and equipment that made our pool demolition look like a weekend gardening project. The EPA had gotten involved after preliminary tests revealed not just construction debris, but contaminated soil from the old heating oil tank, and most shocking of all, traces of industrial chemicals that suggested the original 1940s property had been used for purposes far more sinister than residential housing. Dr. Chen from the city planning office had become a regular presence in our neighborhood, and through our conversations, I learned that Karen's property was likely going to require complete excavation and soil replacement to a depth of 12 feet, a process that would take months and cost well into the six figures. But the most unexpected development came on a Thursday afternoon when Karen Whitmore knocked on our front door. I opened it to find a woman I barely recognized. Gone was the perfectly coiffed real estate agent with her clipboard and accusatory tone. In her place stood someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by the haggard look of someone under enormous stress. "David," she said quietly, "could I speak with you and Sarah for a few minutes? I know I have no right to ask, but it's important." Sarah appeared behind me, curiosity overcoming caution. We invited Karen into our living room, where she sat on the edge of our couch as if she might need to flee at any moment. "I owe you both an apology," Karen began, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than an apology. I owe you an explanation and probably a lot more than that." For the next hour, Karen told us a story that was both heartbreaking and infuriating, a tale of desperation, bad decisions, and the kind of mounting pressure that can drive even good people to do terrible things. She'd known about the contamination for over a year. When she'd first moved into the house 3 years ago, she'd noticed dead patches in her lawn and strange discoloration in her basement walls. A private environmental consultant she'd hired had delivered the devastating news. Her dream home was built on top of an environmental disaster that would require massive remediation and potentially make the property uninhabitable during cleanup. "I couldn't afford it," Karen said, tears streaming down her face. "I'd put everything I had into buying the house after my divorce. My ex-husband had left me with massive debts, and I'd used my real estate commissions just to make the mortgage payments. When I found out about the contamination, I panicked. The harassment of previous neighbors, the constant complaints, the aggressive monitoring of property values. It had all been part of a desperate strategy to maintain the illusion that her property was valuable and problem-free. She'd been terrified that any significant construction or excavation in the neighborhood would lead to the discovery of her secret and the collapse of her financial life. "When I saw your pool removal equipment," Karen continued, "I knew it was only a matter of time. The geological survey for your permits would have detected the contamination plume, and once the city knew..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Karen, why didn't you just tell someone? There are programs, assistance, ways to deal with these situations." Karen's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Because I'm a real estate agent, Sarah. I'm supposed to know about these things. I'm supposed to disclose environmental hazards. If it came out that I'd been living on a contaminated property for years without reporting it, I wouldn't just lose my house. I'd lose my license, my career, everything." The weight of her revelations settled over our living room like a heavy blanket. This woman, whom I'd cast as a villainous neighbor, was actually a victim of circumstances beyond her control, someone who'd made increasingly desperate choices to protect herself from a disaster she couldn't afford to fix. But the story wasn't over. "There's something else," Karen said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Something I found when I was going through all the old property records for the environmental disclosure." She handed me the envelope, and I opened it to find a collection of documents, photographs, and correspondence dating back to the 1940s. As I spread them out on our coffee table, Karen explained what she'd discovered. The original property hadn't just been residential. It had been the site of a small manufacturing operation that produced industrial chemicals for the war effort during World War II. The owner, a man named Robert Davidson, had operated the business with his family until 1947, when new environmental regulations had forced him to shut down and attempt to clean up the site. I stared at the name on the documents, my heart racing. "Davidson," I said quietly. "David," Sarah said, her voice filled with amazement. "Look at this." She was holding up a faded photograph showing a family standing in front of a small industrial building. The man in the center bore an unmistakable resemblance to my father. Karen nodded. "I did some genealogical research. Robert Davidson was your great-grandfather. This property, this contamination, this whole situation, it's connected to your family history." The room spun slightly as the implications sank in. My family had unknowingly moved next door to a property that had been contaminated by my own great-grandfather's business 75 years ago. The environmental disaster that Karen had been hiding was actually, in part, my family's responsibility. "I've been carrying this guilt for months," Karen continued, "knowing that I was harassing innocent neighbors, filing false complaints, making your lives difficult, all to cover up something that wasn't even entirely my fault. But when I realized the connection, I knew I had to tell you everything." Sarah took my hand, her eyes wide with the magnitude of what we'd just learned. "What does this mean legally?" she asked. Karen pulled out another document, a legal brief prepared by her attorney. "It means that the cleanup costs might not be entirely my responsibility. If we can prove that the contamination dates back to your great-grandfather's operation, there might be insurance coverage or other forms of compensation available. More importantly, it means we might be able to work together instead of fighting each other." The conversation that followed lasted until well past midnight. We discussed legal strategies, cleanup timelines, and the possibility of turning this environmental disaster into something positive for the entire neighborhood. By the time Karen left our house, we had the framework of a plan that would benefit everyone involved. Over the next 6 months, our neighborhood became a model for environmental remediation and community cooperation. The cleanup of Karen's property expanded to include soil testing throughout the area, revealing that several other properties had minor contamination that was addressed before it could become a major problem. My family's connection to the original contamination did indeed open doors for additional funding and resources. The state environmental agency was able to access federal cleanup funds specifically designated for addressing legacy contamination from World War II-era manufacturing. What could have been a financial disaster for Karen became a manageable project supported by multiple government programs. But the most remarkable transformation was in Karen herself. The stress and secrecy that had driven her to become the neighborhood's most difficult resident evaporated once everything was out in the open. She threw herself into the cleanup project with the same obsessive attention to detail that had once made her such a troublesome neighbor. But now her energy was channeled toward solving problems rather than creating them. Sarah's garden project expanded beyond our backyard to include a community space on the remediated portion of Karen's property. The city approved a variance that allowed us to create a shared neighborhood garden where families could grow vegetables and children could learn about environmental stewardship. The pool that had started this entire saga was replaced with a beautiful water feature that served as the centerpiece of our new garden space. Sarah's orchid greenhouse became a community resource where Karen, who turned out to have a remarkable talent for horticulture, taught classes on sustainable gardening and environmental restoration. Most importantly, Sarah's health improved dramatically. The stress of our legal battles had given way to the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the physical act of